Okay, well, here we go. Week 2. Just want to remind you though, so we are starting week 2 now. Not everyone has fully engaged in week 1. And again, to fully engage, you have to answer every question fully. I mean, to the best of your ability. I ask questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, as long as whatever you say can be supported by looking back at the poem or whatever text it is we're looking at in the future. So provide a quote, refer to a specific image, or a way in which the poem moves, which is something we're going to talk a little bit more about this week. But you need to make those posts, and you need to go back on there and see what your peers are saying, congratulate them on doing a good job of answering the question, maybe even add some more evidence for them that perhaps they missed, or feel free to challenge them and ask them why they say what they say. But that needs to happen, and there's more discussion boards in these early weeks because the reading is so light, frankly. We will have more reading once we get into prose and fewer questions. But for now, you've got small texts to look at. They are very concentrated, so I'm asking you to look at them carefully through various questions. So we have, I believe, 7 discussion questions this week, which means for this week, you should be posting 21 times. Which to me that doesn't really sound like a lot. It's the first 7 where I'm asking specific questions where you need to have detailed answers. That can be a little time consuming. But again, you're doing a little less reading by word count. So do make sure you do the full work. I'm gonna have to start going through those and probably emailing people and telling many of you that you got zeros for week 1. I mean, there's like 15 people enrolled in the class, and I think about 5 people answered the questions. So that's not a good start. You don't want to fall behind in this class because we're on week 2. Week 3 coming up will be our last week, if I remember correctly, of romantic poems. And then we're going to move into the Victorian period. Before you know it, we'll be reading full-length texts. So get on that. I would suggest if you're having a hard time taking the time to sit down at a computer somewhere, download the app. I've had summer classes in the past where I would respond to student questions on or in the discussion boards from the beach. You can do the same. You can just sit wherever's comfortable, by the pool or something, wherever you may be, wherever you like to hang out under a tree somewhere. Just use the app. Use the app. The app is really great. It's the Blackboard app. Download it, sign into CCRI through there, and you can do almost all the work, especially when we're reading poems that I've posted on there. You can do almost all your classwork on your phone. So feel free to do that. I think that's a great idea. Okay, so that was more time than I wanted to spend talking about procedure and things, so I'm just going to have to maybe write announcements on Blackboard in the future when you guys are kind of slacking off like this. So, because I want to move into the content of the week. We're really at the turn of the 19th century, finally. So that's why Victorianism is coming soon. But the poets for the week here are William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. These guys are they're legit founders, if you might say, of romantic poetry. And again, they did look back and kind of consider Blake sort of a godfather of what they were doing, but they had very specific ideas. And one thing you're definitely going to want to take some time with this week as far as reading goes is this preface to the Lyrical Ballads. So the Lyrical Ballads were published right about 1798, I believe, as a collaboration effort between William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, our 2 poets of the week, to sort of try to break new ground and write poems in new ways. And they expected people not to get it or to even hate it. So after it was widely hated by a lot of critics, in 1800, William Wordsworth wrote his preface to the Lyrical Ballads. So they basically republished this book with a preface. And then you'll see that the one I believe the one I gave you is from 1802, but Wordsworth added more ideas and stuff to the 1802 printing. And so there's 2 prefaces. There's an 1800, 1802. They're very, very similar. And so one thing that's really important to these guys is nature and being natural, and whatever that means to them. So one of those things would be not thinking of the human as a computer or something, not some kind of a accounting machine. Like, your brain is not a computer. I mean, they wouldn't have used those terms, but the idea that there is more to humanity than simply being rational. And so one of the other things that's really important is, like I said, nature. You might even put it in capital N. Being out in nature is the thing that we think about all the time, and I think we don't even take it for granted that what that means, going out to the woods or going for a hike somewhere. I think it's important to note that for men of, or you might even say people, right? People of this time period, nature was something all of a sudden set apart and different, because cities as we know them today really start to come around and be born. The Industrial Revolution is kicking off, so there's more machinery in the city. There's starting to become more smoke in the city. The city is something that we think of as urban and man-made and an environment completely apart from the rest of creation, as it were, is kind of a new concept. And so once you have the city as we know it, then all of a sudden it's opposite, if you will. This idea of nature becomes important. And so that's one of the things they like, as well as improvising, this idea of impulse over planning. A lot of the stuff they do, Wordsworth has so many poems that are literally we're just told the title of the poem is where he composed it, as if he saw something beautiful, sat down and immediately wrote a whole poem, or sometimes he would claim to have written the poem in his head and wrote it down later. But this idea of following your spark, your impulse of creativity, and something that an American writer, like, I don't know, 150, 160 years later, would call first thought, best thought. That would be the beat writer. Oh my gosh, it's not really important to this course, but I'm just blanking. But anyway, maybe it'll come back to me later. Kerouac, Jack Kerouac. And I only bring that up because it is really interesting to think about how literature influences other writers in the future. These guys were like the OG hippies, you might say, like the original idea of anything that we might call a hippie. Some people think of the hippies as being something that happens in America in the 1970s, but something that inspired them was the beat poets of the 50s, who were in turn inspired by some of the stuff that William Wordsworth wrote in this preface to the Lyrical Ballads. I could even argue, or some do argue, that the beat poets of the 1950s actually did exactly closer to what William Wordsworth claims he's trying to do. But it's getting a little far afield, I suppose. So imagination as a central power, the power of your own mind over institutional learning, all of these things are really important to them. Wordsworth was really heavily influenced by what happened in the French Revolution. He had a good friend who was a soldier over there who fought for the French Revolution, and he became all about democracy and liberty, and flirted with atheism for a little while. And his friend Coleridge, they actually spent a lot of time going on long walks out in the country where they would talk about philosophy and ideas, and sometimes even allegedly compose whole poems on a walk. So that's the kind of guys we're talking about. Coleridge in particular, though, he wrote a lot less poetry after he turned 30. He sort of had a huge productive period, and then, not that he didn't write poetry after his 30s, but he spent a lot more time being a critic of poetry and culture. In fact, at one point early in his life, he had married a woman whose sister married one of his friends, and they, along with some other poets, talked about setting up a whole commune. So you want to talk about like hippie stuff. They literally wanted, and then that's a thing hippies did, right? These communes are like supposed to be self-sustaining, independently little governed areas where everybody's completely equal and no one's in charge. And that's something that he tried to get going for a little while. He was also a little bit of a drug addict, and that shows in one of the poems we'll see this week. But another key idea that I want to talk about very, very briefly before the video gets too long, is just this idea of the way poetry moves. even if a poet is just describing it, it seems to you that they're just describing a very static, non-moving, we're just looking at something pretty, there's going to be some shift, I like to call it, or a turn, where the poem goes somewhere else. The tone of the poem will change. The content of the poem might change a little bit. The point of view of the poem might change a little bit. Something is going to turn or shift. And some of those are going to be done through structure, which I've discussed specifically in some of the discussion questions. For example, with the sonnets. Sonnets always have a Shakespearean sonnet usually has a nice little cutting, ironic, or insightful turn at the end. At the very end, the last two lines are usually the and boom. But what we've looked at this week are Italian sonnets, sometimes called Petrarchan sonnets, and they are like a two-part structure. The first 8 lines work together to introduce a theme or a problem, and the last 6 lines will either resolve that problem or build on that theme and take it somewhere different than you might have thought it was going to go in the beginning. In addition to that, I want us to think about making some connections. So the last question of the week is kind of like saving the best for last. Once you've read and thought about the poems I've given you in the discussion board, think about, discussion boards to think about. The last thing I want you to do is go back and think about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Think about how well did these men execute what they, I say they, even though William Wordsworth is given credit for the preface. These guys were collaborators. These are thoughts they shared. So how well did they execute maybe their plan, right? The word manifesto is sort of used a lot for this preface, and it just kind of means like an explanation of our movement. This is what we plan to do. And people write manifestos for all kinds of things, art or culture or politics. This is their poetic manifesto, you might say. And so I think a really important thing to think about is if a writer tells you this is what I was trying to accomplish, go back and see how well they did what they said they were going to do. And again, as always with these discussion boards, I want you to be specific. It's honestly not that hard to quote a poem. You can go back at a glance and find the line that you're thinking of or the line that made you think a certain kind of way. It's going to be a little harder when I ask you to give me some textual evidence from the longer works that are on the horizon. So basically get in the habit now of noting particular lines, word choices, and phrases that have a certain resonance for you or you think mean a certain thing, or even if you don't really understand, those are good places to maybe even throw a question of your own into a comment. And I'm going to go through last week's commentary very soon and give you guys some final thoughts on those, so look out for that. All right, well, enjoy the beginning of the official romantic movement here. And as always, you have my email address. Send me any questions you have, and I will respond to them. All right, enjoy.